Hey there! Did you know Baker's always gives you savings and rewards on top of our lower-than-low prices? And when you download the Baker's app, you'll enjoy over $500 in savings every week with digital coupons. And don't forget fuel points to help you save up to $1 per gallon at the pump. Want to save even more? With a Boost membership, you'll get double fuel points and free delivery. So shop and save big at Baker's today. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Savings may vary by state. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
At Planet Fitness, Leap Day means an extra day of energy. And who doesn't love energy? To celebrate, now through February 29th, you can join for 29 cents down, $10 a month, and pay nothing until March 17th. Even better, you'll get free fitness training and equipment for every workout, with most clubs open 24 hours. So take advantage of your extra day and get energized at Planet Fitness. Join for 29 cents down, $10 a month, cancel anytime, and pay nothing until March 17th. Deal ends February 29th. See Home Club for details.
Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 2, Episode 60. You and What Army? Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Samuel Hume. Before we begin today, we have to welcome the new members of my Patreon House of Lords, Baroness Amy, Baron Matt, and Baron Simon. They, along with every other patron, receive ad-free podcasts. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to find out more. When last we met, outside of our bonus episode on Cromwell and Christmas, we saw how Charles I, King of England, Ireland, and Scotland, had worn out his welcome in the custody of the Scottish Covenanters. He'd lost the Civil War, and his enemies now presented him with the terms of his defeat, the Newcastle Propositions. These included the abolition of episcopacy, parliamentary control of the English military for 20 years, parliamentary nomination of the king's officials, the ending of any negotiations with the Irish Confederacy, the annulment of the cessation, complete parliamentary control over the Irish War and the exclusion of the Scots from it, and that the king signed the Solemn League and Covenant. But then Charles did something really annoying. He just refused them. The terms were just unacceptable to him, so he refused to agree to them. So what if he'd lost the war? What exactly were his enemies going to do? He'd always be king, and they'd have to come to terms with that fact. So Charles carried on winding down the clock, convinced that eventually he'd find a deal that he could accept, or that he'd use one part of the anti-Charles coalition to defeat the rest. Eventually, though, his Scottish hosts got tired of waiting. Aware that their continued occupation of the north of England was increasingly unpopular, they cut their losses. For a gargantuan price of £400,000 to pay off the cost of their intervention, the army of the Covenant agreed to withdraw back across the border, and they left Charles behind. But Charles wasn't necessarily wrong to see fractures in the coalition. His enemies were deeply divided. The Scots from the English, and the English and Scots from the Irish Confederates. But within these kingdoms there was division. Beneath the surface of Scottish politics was a deeply fractious situation, one which would in time lead to the outbreak of war. Among the Confederates, the war party, led by the papal nuncio Archbishop Rinuccini, was dominant, but they'd already had to execute a coup to deny an alliance with the king. And in England, Parliament's House of Commons was a house divided. The Presbyterians on one hand, who desired and demanded religious uniformity on a Calvinist and quasi-Presbyterian system, and the Independents, who believed that one of the main things they'd fought the Civil War for had been personal religious liberty against a tyrannical state church. This was not just a theological dispute. Parliament's victorious army, the New Model Army, was increasingly seen by the Presbyterians as a threat, and by the Independents as an ally. The Presbyterians had already tried, unsuccessfully, to neuter the military that had just won them the war. In today's episode, we'll start the ball rolling on quite how badly the Presbyterians mishandled the new model army. With the death of the Earl of Essex, the leading light of the Presbyterian faction in Parliament was Denzil Holles. We've seen Holles before. Before personal rule, he had been one of the MPs who had drafted the Petition of Right and held the Speaker down in his chair. During the political crisis before the Civil War, he was one of the 5 members which the king had attempted, and embarrassingly failed, to arrest. He'd been one of the leading Presbyterian members of the Commons throughout the war, and now that Essex was dead, his influence only increased. After a series of recruiter elections, by-elections to replace MPs who had retired, died of natural causes or in the Civil War, and those who had been purged due to supporting the king in that war, the Commons was now flooded with new faces. Now these new arrivals tended to come from royalist constituencies, since many of their predecessors had been purged for their allegiance. For voters from these regions, the Presbyterian approach of quickly making a deal with the king, disbanding the standing army, and returning to normality suited them down to the ground. This meant that Holles and the other Presbyterian leaders could usually rely on these moderate votes in the Commons, giving them an advantage over the independents. Holles' strategy, according to Kishlansky, was brilliantly simple. Charles had made it very clear that he would never concede his beloved bishops or control over the military. So, Holles decided not to give him the option. The bishops had, after all, already been abolished by parliamentary ordinance the previous October. The sale of their lands, which paid for the withdrawal of the Scots and the transfer of the king, also removed the financial pillar which their restoration would need. It would be much more difficult for the king to simply decree that the episcopacy was back when the bishop's lands were now in a multitude of private and influential hands. The Assembly of Divines concluded its confession of faith, which Parliament would approve in November. Meanwhile, the last military concern was Ireland. Divisions of the new model army would be dispatched to the rebellious kingdom under Presbyterian commanders. In England, most strongholds would be demolished, and those strategic positions which had to be manned would be commanded by Presbyterians. All other forces in England would be disbanded. Then, the king would be presented with a fait accompli, which he could not easily reverse, but also one which didn't press on his conscience. He wasn't being asked to concede on these key issues because they would already be settled. Everything else could then be negotiated, and the king could be invited back to his throne. This was clever, but Holles dramatically underestimated the resistance he would face from the new model army. Perhaps buoyed up by anti-army feeling in London, where the London Common Council, which we mentioned in episode 258, had recently come out against the army, now Holles, backed by Presbyterians in Parliament, struck. On the 18th of February, the Commons, after an all-day debate, carried a motion which stated that only 5,400 cavalry and 1,000 dragoons from the new model army would be maintained in England as garrison forces. Everything else, the infantry and the rest of the mounted soldiers, would be given a choice: disband or serve in Ireland. Further, the motion stated that no MP could serve in the army, reinforcing the self-denying ordinance, and that no officer could be exempt from swearing the Solemn League and Covenant. Exceptions had been made on both counts during the war, but that was in the past. Obviously, Cromwell would fall afoul of both of these conditions, but so would Henry Ireton and many other independents in the army. And, very importantly, the ordinance did not offer to settle the army's outstanding pay or pensions. With the passing of this ordinance, the new model army would cease to be a threat, a deal with the king could be reached, and the rebels in Ireland would be crushed. Except there was one very important group of people who had not been consulted. That's right, it's that very same bunch of veterans with a load of guns. When the army received word of this motion, they had one very important question for the politicians in Westminster. You and what army? Because we are your army. The new model had just won the war, and there was no sizable parliamentary force outside of the new model. And even before Parliament passed this deeply insulting motion, the officers and enlisted men had grievances. Many of them, like I said, hadn't been paid in months, and with the end of the war there were plenty who were quite worried that they would now be held liable for crimes they'd committed in winning it. And these are just the practical concerns. There was a strong streak of independency in the army. There was a lot of anger felt towards the king, who, they believed, had caused the war. So it's unsurprising to find calls from the army for strict crackdowns on Catholicism, toleration for all Protestant worship, and a harsh negotiating position with the king, which were all directly opposed to Holles' strategy. The officers shared many of these complaints, and when news of Parliament's decision broke and their men began to get openly mutinous, the officers took their men's side. A petition was drafted by the army, and it listed 3 core demands. Firstly, they wanted to be paid. The parliamentary motion made no allowances for any wages which were in arrears, or promised to pay the men until they were disbanded. They wanted what was owed to them, and they wanted pensions for the injured and for the families of killed soldiers. Secondly, they demanded indemnity for any crimes committed under arms. And finally, no one would be made to fight outside the kingdom against their will. This meant Ireland. Many leading officers signed it, including plenty of independent officers like Colonel Oakey, Henry Ireton, and Thomas Pride. This petition was presented to a parliamentary commission which had travelled to the army's muster at Saffron Walden. They'd arrived expecting to get on with the job of disbanding most of the force and building a new Irish army. Instead, they were handed the petition, told to take it back to Parliament, and not to let the tent flap hit them on the way out. Gentles proposes that, had Holles and the Presbyterian faction in Parliament, quote, addressed these demands in a timely fashion and handled the soldiers with tact, they might have achieved their goal of dissolving the new model army. As it was, tact was not their concern. End quote. Holles reacted to these fairly reasonable demands with outraged fury. He hadn't considered resistance from the army in his plan to deal with the king. He needed their immediate and total cooperation, and any resistance or negotiation from them threatened his plan for the peace settlement. It has to be said that, in this moment, Oliver Cromwell was not a calming presence. He'd been deathly ill over the winter, and appears to have been genuinely depressed once he recovered. He was disappointed by the course of events, and once again was considering emigration, either to the New World or to the continent. But by this point he was well enough to return to the Commons. While he sympathised with the grievances of the army, he still firmly believed that discipline had to be maintained. He was deeply concerned about the growing mutinous feeling among the troops and the lower officers, and, while agreeing with most of the points in their petition, Antonia Fraser notes that Cromwell, quote, felt that the common soldiers had nevertheless gone distinctly too far in presenting their own petition. End quote. Now back in the Commons, for the fateful debate on the petition, he stood and put his hand on his heart, and swore, quote, in the presence of Almighty God, before whom he stood, that he knew that the army would disband and lay down their arms at their door whensoever they should command them. Now this is interesting, because Cromwell was completely wrong. His contemporary enemies would later accuse him of deliberately fanning the flames of this crisis for personal and political gain. But Fraser suggests that actually Cromwell was just very bad at predicting political events. But he was also very lucky and quite good at reacting to them. So to his enemies, Cromwell looked like a master manipulator, a Palpatine-esque figure who was weaving sinister plots to serve his aims, working both sides of the conflict until he could seize power for himself, when instead he made bad political prophecies and reacted well in a crisis. So it's entirely likely that Cromwell either genuinely believed his oath, or hoped that his promise that the army was loyal and should not be feared would be enough to win Parliament over. In which case, with their grievances settled, the new model probably would have done exactly what Cromwell promised they would. But if this last option was Cromwell's intention, he badly misjudged the situation and how little sympathy Parliament had for the army. With Cromwell suggesting that Parliament still held the army's confidence and the army would do what Parliament said, the Presbyterians passed a vote ordering the petition to be suppressed. Again, Holles had not accounted for a very important element: the politicisation of the army. Throughout March, the cavalry regiments of the army began to elect agitators to represent their grievances to their officers and to Parliament. This trend began with 8 regiments based in East Anglia, who elected 2 agitators from each regiment. They condemned the actions of Parliament and demanded the redress of their grievances. The election of agitators spread like wildfire through the army, with regiments of infantry quickly joining their cavalry comrades and choosing their own representatives. Among the ranks of the army grew another political cause: the Levellers. Once again, we aren't talking about a formal group or political party, but defined more by shared causes and association. The name Leveller was attributed to them by their enemies, just like Puritan, and leading Levellers would try and deny the label. But here we are, 4 centuries later, calling them Levellers. Their enemies accused the group of political radicalism, and of wanting the complete levelling of social rank, and the redistribution of private property and land. The most prominent Levellers always denied and disputed this accusation, though that didn't stop their enemies, nor does it stop some historians viewing the group as proto-socialist. So what did the Levellers say they wanted? The general principles can be summed up as religious toleration, free trade, justice reform, a written constitution, and the widening of the franchise. All utterly insane proposals which would undermine the very structure of society and could only lead to the complete breakdown of law and order and the great chain of being. I'm sure you can agree. Essentially, we can see in the Levellers the logical extension of Parliament's own rhetoric. They'd fought the civil war against the king on the basis that Parliament, and especially the Commons, represented the will of the people, and that of the 3 pillars of the kingdom, the monarch, lords, and commons, it was the Commons which best governed for the common weal. Parliament had spent 5 years championing representative politics. The Levellers simply carried this argument 1 or several dozen steps forward. The Commons should not just be the first among equals, between the monarch and the lords, but above both. The other 2 pillars would have their role, of course. Outright republicanism was rarely suggested at this point, but neither should be able to restrain or overrule the Commons. The second major principle of Leveller thought, intertwined with the political question and also an extension of parliamentary rhetoric, was the importance of individual liberty from tyranny. This overlapped easily with the agenda of the Independents, and that's no coincidence. Many Levellers started their careers in the independent churches in London. The Independents wanted religious toleration. They wanted the freedom for each congregation to worship as they saw fit, without a state-mandated clergy clamping down on them and, branding their cheeks or cropping their ears. Securing individual political liberty would help ensure individual religious liberty. Leveller ideas found fertile soil wherever the new model army gathered. The demand for political reform and a greater say in government for ordinary men was very appealing to the thousands of ordinary men currently in a dispute with their government. What came to be termed the army Levellers would begin to throw their weight around in the growing crisis. But, just to throw another wrench into the complicated mess of 1647, we should be wary of overemphasising the importance of Leveller ideas in the army. Many of the complaints of the army had nothing to do with high-minded ideals of liberty and constitutional politics. A lot of them just wanted to be paid, and not sent to fight and die in Ireland against their will. But many of the agitators in the army were Levellers, and these ordinary grievances fit neatly with larger Leveller principles. So with the army becoming increasingly mutinous and increasingly political, when Parliament ordered that the army petition be suppressed and no one should share or sign it, well, that didn't work. No one listened. By the end of March, it was clear that Parliament's attempt to silence the army had failed, and that the petition was still being widely discussed. So Holles escalated. He once again used the Commons to try and maintain control. Another motion accused the agitators of deliberately pushing the army into a distemper and mutiny, and called the soldiers who resisted Parliament's demands enemies of the state. Commissioners were dispatched to the army's headquarters in Essex to identify the writers of the petition and arrest them.
At Planet Fitness, Leap Day means an extra day of energy. And who doesn't love energy? To celebrate, now through February 29th, you can join for 29 cents down, $10 a month, and pay nothing until March 17th. Even better, you'll get free fitness training and equipment for every workout, with most clubs open 24 hours. So take advantage of your extra day and get energized at Planet Fitness. Join for 29 cents down, $10 a month, cancel anytime, and pay nothing until March 17th. Deal ends February 29th. See Home Club for details.
Madame Tussaud. We all know the name, and many of us have visited one of the wax museums which bear that name. But you may not realise the historical significance of the woman behind the name, or how she and her waxworks defined the genre of true crime. If that has piqued your interest, then give The Art of Crime a listen. The Art of Crime is a history podcast by Gavin Whitehead, a historian of Victorian theatre, all about the unlikely collisions between true crime and the arts. If you enjoy the detail of Pax Britannica, then you'll love The Art of Crime. The latest season of The Art of Crime tells two stories. First, it chronicles Tussaud's career, starting in pre-revolutionary France and ending in Victorian London. Second, it tracks the evolution of the Chamber of Horrors, a showroom in her wax museum that exhibited macabre curiosities, including effigies of notorious criminals. You'll hear how Tussaud won patronage from the French royal family, narrowly escaped the guillotine during the Reign of Terror, and became one of the most celebrated showwomen in Paris and London. This season also covers the most divisive assassin of the French Revolution, the last man to be hung, drawn and quartered for high treason in England, and the glamorous murderer who attained notoriety as a modern Lady Macbeth. Subscribe to The Art of Crime wherever you get your podcasts. Let me recommend another history podcast on the Airwave Network. Historical Blindness attempts to shed some light on historical blind spots and fight the misinformation that permeates many people's worldview. Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false beliefs today? Join host Nathaniel Lloyd as he delves into all these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. Find out what's real and what's not when it comes to famous conspiracy claims, like those surrounding the notorious assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and JFK. Discover astonishing parallels to modern politics. What does the false claim that AIDS was a US bioweapon tell us about the COVID lab leak conspiracy theory? Find and subscribe to Historical Blindness wherever you listen to your podcasts, or visit historicalblindness.com. This declaration of dislike was, to quote Gentles, the crossing of the Rubicon for Holles and the Presbyterians. The declaration not only tried to revoke their right to petition, a bedrock of English politics, but offended their honour by calling them enemies of the state. Again, they had just won the war for Parliament. They expected to be paid as they were promised, they'd invoked their ancient right as Englishmen to petition, and now they were being accused of being enemies of the state? How else were they meant to make their wishes known? The commissioners arrived at Saffron Walden and informed the army that, no, Parliament was not accepting their petition, and they had a choice to either disband or serve in Ireland under officers of Parliament's choosing. Notably, not Oliver Cromwell and not Sir Thomas Fairfax. Sir Edward Massey would be returned to command as Lieutenant General of Horse, replacing Cromwell, and Skippon would be elevated to Field Marshal in place of Fairfax. In response, 200 officers gathered in a nearby church insisted that Fairfax preside over their meeting and began to chant, all, Fairfax and Cromwell and we all go. The next day, another petition was drafted and signed and sent to Parliament stating this new position. Holles fundamentally misjudged the vulnerability of his position. Parliament half-heartedly tried to appease the army and in April voted to pay 6 weeks' pay, which was far less than many were owed, and far too late to be seen as a gesture of goodwill. Instead of attempting to placate the new model army, the Presbyterians decided to crush them. Holles began to bring together 4 different fonts of manpower into one Presbyterian parliamentary army. The first was, of course, the London-trained bands. The second was the army of Major General Points, stationed in the north of England and commanding one of the few remaining forces which hadn't disbanded or merged with the new model. The third came from the new model itself, those divisions and regiments which had accepted the parliamentary ordinance and were deemed suitably loyal to Parliament. The fourth were those officers and men who had been removed from command during the new modelling of the army. When the new model ordinance had combined dozens of undermanned forces into more substantial commands, a lot of officers were surplus to requirements, wished well in their future endeavours, and were sacked. Now these men loitered in the capital, nursing grudges against their former comrades in the new model army. These men are sometimes called the Reformados. There was a fifth element which Holles was eager to bring to bear against the new model army. Just months after they had finally left the kingdom, the Scots would be invited back into England. But as we've seen, the Covenanters were no longer sure that their interests, and the interests of Scotland, were best served by aligning themselves with a faction of the English Parliament. Besides, they had their own political problems to deal with. After the declaration of dislike, the politicisation of the army was unstoppable, even by their officers. Not that many officers wanted to try. Especially among the junior officers, sympathy for their men was strong, and the accusations and the insults of the declaration applied to them as well. Up to this point, it feels like the new model was acting reactively, on the defensive, and in response to moves by Holles and the parliamentary Presbyterians. But in May 1647, this would abruptly change. Oliver Cromwell, deeply unhappy with the growing crisis, began to consider leaving England entirely. The cause of Charles Louis, Elector Palatine, was still a very pressing affair, even with the 30 Years' War now in its 29th year. Maybe this was the next godly cause which the Almighty Lord wanted Cromwell to pursue. He had many meetings with the nephew of the king he had just defeated, and it's entirely possible that Cromwell would have sailed from England in 1647. But instead, in May, Cromwell was appointed as one of the 4 commissioners sent to Essex to try and settle the growing crisis with the army. All 4 were both MPs and commissioned officers in that army: Cromwell, Henry Ireton, Philip Skippon, and Charles Fleetwood. On the 15th of May, Skippon and Cromwell presided over a meeting of 200 officers. Aside from having to tell a few speakers off for being too passionate, men like Oakey, Waller, and John Lambert, their demands were very reasonable. They wanted more than the 6 weeks' pay already promised. They wanted to be able to petition. Parliament should seriously consider their earlier petition, and Parliament shouldn't allow any further attacks on the honour of the army. The next day, the commissioners reported back to Parliament that the army's grievances were deeply felt, and that they, the commissioners, sympathised with the grievances, though not the unrest, and they suggested that the army would disband peacefully if its grievances were addressed. Parliament took this suggestion, ran with it, and then promptly tripped over and fell flat on its face. Cromwell and the other commissioners looked on in horror as the Houses took their suggestions, offered meagre concessions, and then continued on their hostile path, insisting on service in Ireland and the disbanding of the remaining regiments, with only the promise that the rest of their grievances would be settled, just as soon as they gave up all their leverage and agreed to Parliament's demands. Fairfax communicated Parliament's latest offer to the officers, who rejected it. The Commander-in-Chief was only precariously maintaining his authority over the increasingly mutinous troops. Fairfax wrote to Parliament, informing them that, "I am forced to yield to something out of order, to keep the army from disorder, or worse inconveniences." Fairfax migrated his headquarters to Bury St Edmunds, and there he fell sick. Without the steadying hand of Fairfax, events continued to spiral. Colonel Rainsborough's regiment, stationed at Portsmouth, heard rumours that Parliament was about to act against them. They mutinied and marched on Oxford in order to take control of the former royalist capital and current home for much of the new model army's artillery. Rumours also began to spread that Parliament and the Presbyterian troops that answered to them were going to move the king, either to London or to hand him back to the Scots, so that the Scots could then invade and defeat the new model army. And then, At the end of May, one George Joyce, a cornet in Fairfax's own cavalry regiment, seized the initiative when he arrived at Holmby House to take custody over the king. Charles I was now in the hands of the army. Before we end this episode, I've included a link in the show notes to a survey. It's mostly a way for me to learn more about you, how you found the podcast, how you're finding the podcast, what you'd like to see more or less of, that kind of thing. It's only short, so if you have a few minutes to scroll through, I'd greatly appreciate it, and it will help guide the show. Also, at the end is a simple scale of interest in a project I've been thinking about for a couple of years now. A new, focused, highly produced podcast on the end of the British Empire. Focusing on a separate part of the Empire each season, with each episode consisting of narrative and clips of interviews with historians. Think the style of Fall of Civilizations meets the BBC's Time Travels. There's a lot more to it than that, but until things are in motion, that's all I can really say. So, once again, the link to the survey is in the episode description. Thank you to my House of Lords, including but not limited to the King's favourite, Mike Sanders, the Duke of Bristol, Bill Winkis, the Marquess of Hull, Steve Cloutier, and the Countess of Coventry, Linda Knowlton. If you'd like to join their ranks and, at a minimum, receive an ad-free RSS feed, go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to find out more. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, please recommend it to a friend or post about the show on social media. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.
Freedom is all about choices, and while there is only one Jeep brand, you have the freedom to choose from an epic lineup of Jeep brand vehicles. Hit the trails with the versatile classic, the Jeep Gladiator, or experience the wild and style with the sophistication and comfort of the Jeep Grand Cherokee or Jeep Grand Cherokee 4xe. Looking for a more immersive experience? Let nature come to you in the open-air Jeep Wrangler or Jeep Wrangler 4xe, America's best-selling plug-in hybrid. Whatever you choose, adventure is just one drive away. Visit Jeep.com for details. Based on 2022 CYQ4 sales, GD Power retail sales data, Jeep is a registered trademark.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.